China's foreign minister visits East Africa. Wang Yi begins his first trip of the year, aiming to set the pace for future cooperation on the Belt and Road Initiative. But how much does Africa need and want more Chinese investment? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is China's relationship with Africa. China has kicked off 2022 by reaffirming its relationship with Africa. The foreign minister is continuing what's become a diplomatic tradition since 1991 by making his first trip of the year abroad to the African continent. Wang Yi is visiting Eritrea, Kenya, and the Comoros this time. Now, China has pumped billions of dollars into the continent in recent years, and while mega projects funded by Beijing are often officially welcomed, some fear the dangers of China's outsized influence and the creation of massive debt. But in November, during the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, Beijing pledged to support Africa without imposing its will.
Within the framework of the new Silk Roads, the African Infrastructure Development Program and the Continental Free Trade Area, there is great potential for the Chinese-African partnership in terms of structuring infrastructure projects.
The cooperation between China and Africa is a dynamic cooperation, wanted and accepted by all our states and shared by our respective peoples. The second thing this means is that we, the African and Chinese governments, are aware of our responsibility, FOCAC being our common asset, to persevere, to continue to deepen, to widen this cooperation.
Chinese state media is also touting the progress of the Africa-China economic partnership. According to Xinhua, Africa's trade with China crossed $200 billion last year, an increase of 40% over the year before. Under the Belt and Road Initiative, China has funded the construction of highways, railways, power plants, and other infrastructure projects across the continent. Eritrea also joined Chinese President Xi Jinping's signature initiative in November in a move that helps China cement its foothold in the Horn of Africa. Well, let's take a look now at a few of China's most prominent projects on the continent. In Tanzania, the $10 billion Bagamoyo port was built in cooperation with a state-owned Chinese company. Kenya's largest infrastructure project since independence, the Mombasa-Nairobi Railway, was funded by China at an estimated cost of $3.6 billion. Nigeria's Lagos-Ibadan Railway has been funded by the China Civil Engineering Construction Company. The cost of that project, $1.6 billion. In Angola, China signed a deal for the construction of the Kakulo-Kabaka hydropower plant worth $4.5 billion. And in Ethiopia, China has funded the Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway for $4.5 billion. So is this investment mutually beneficial, or is there an element of exploitation here that some even label debt trap diplomacy? Well, joining me now to discuss the Chinese foreign minister's visit to East Africa and its implications are Victor Gao from Beijing. He is a chair professor at Soochow University. From Nairobi, Aly-Khan Satchu, the founder and CEO of Rich Management and a specialist in emerging economies. And in Nigeria's capital, Abuja, is Ovigwe Eguegu. He is a policy analyst at Development Reimagined, a consultancy specializing in African international relations. Thanks all so much for being with us. Victor Gao, let me start with you. I mean, how much does this trip to Kenya, Eritrea, and Comoros actually mean to Beijing, especially when it comes, to accessing the Red Sea via the Indian Ocean?
Thank you very much for having me. Happy New Year. You may know that for every year, the first visit by the Chinese foreign minister abroad will be to Africa. This has been the case for more than 10 years. This demonstrates the symbolism as well as the substance of China-African relations. It is based on mutual respect and mutual benefit and mutual support. Now, these three African countries are each important to China in its own way, but collectively, they reflect the continued support of China for all African countries, big or small, wherever they are, in whichever part of Africa they may find themselves in. Now, I would say Red Sea channel all the way to Suez Canal and the Mediterranean, etc. This is important to China as well as to every other country. After all, China is the largest trading nation in the world, the largest manufacturing country in the world, and to make sure that this navigation route is safely secured is as important to China as to many other maritime nations. Now, Kenya has always been important to China. Mutual respect between these two countries has been long-standing, and I personally have many friends in Africa, especially in Kenya. Comoros is not within the continent itself, but it is part of the Indian Ocean, and as such, it is commanding a lot of geopolitical importance nowadays, especially when the United States and several other countries are talking about Indian Pacific concept. So I would say China will deal with these three countries as important as each of it is, as its tradition in dealing with African countries with respect.
Okay. Aly-Khan Satchu, let me turn to you. You are in Kenya, really a prime example of, African-Chinese economic cooperation, which actually has some real hindsight now after a few decades of investment. So how beneficial has it been for Kenya? What has felt tangibly better in Kenya since China started investing billions of dollars?
Well, of course, the railway is the single biggest investment that Kenya has undertaken since independence. This was largely financed and built by the Chinese. This is the SGR, the flagship project of the current government. Our roads, the Chinese investment in road building has been a unique phenomenon here in Kenya. So we cannot be gainsaid the importance of the relationship that Kenya enjoys with China. Kenya is, of course, balancing very long-held, long-standing relationships with the US and Europe, and basically is seeking to accommodate not only China, but other long-standing partners. But there can be no doubt that China's influence here has been enormous, and particularly in the last 10 years. And if you go back a few centuries, of course, Admiral Zheng He visited the Kenyan coast many centuries ago. So, we like to think that it's been a long-standing relationship. What's interesting for me pertaining to this particular visit is I think what you're seeing is the center of gravity, of economic gravity, shifting towards the Indian Ocean region, the wider region, 3 billion consumers on this doorstep. And I think this visit is by the foreign minister is paying, is giving importance to that new and emerging center of gravity of the global economy.
Okay.
I think there are three slightly different things. I mean, Comoros, small country, huge economic exclusion zone. That would be of interest to China. And then Eritrea, you've had this rapprochement rather recent with the Eritreans joining the BRI and becoming seemingly a much stronger partner to China.
Okay, I want to talk more about Eritrea in just a second, because it's a pretty big development, actually, since many have seen Eritrea as somewhat of a pariah state, and China's engagement will be much valued there, many analysts would argue. But let me turn to Ovigwe in Abuja, because I want to ask about what the cynics in this case, let's put it that way, and those who argue that this is about debt trap diplomacy, that jobs are not actually being created for Africans, they're being more created for Chinese that have been brought to Africa for the BRI's development. What's your take?
Yeah, well, it was a good thing to see that the visits from the Chinese foreign minister it continued in 2022. So with Africa being the first region of the world that Chinese foreign ministers visit, and that tradition being continued into this year is quite it's quite positive. But if we look at the particular countries, for instance, Eritrea in this context, just recently joining the BRI, I think it follows a pattern of other African countries recognizing, what is on the table, or in terms of their economic development, whether we're looking at trade and investment, or infrastructure development, and even export, because of course we know China has a burgeoning, middle class and a consumer market. But if we're looking specifically at those narratives, that are really being pushed mostly from, Western media about, debt trap, you only just have to look at the, the figures. Most of the projects that will be executed on the continent have been largely positive. Particularly, we might have problem in terms of, maybe, the SGR, for instance, might have some concern, but to a large extent, many of the other, projects have been very positive in terms of cutting travel time, facilitating, trade between like manufacturing hubs and cities, connecting agricultural communities, to export markets. So I don't think it's really, grounded in reality to summarize the BRI as some form of, a debt trap. Rather, it's just maybe one or two few cases where we're having, concerns and still not really clear or explicitly clear that we have like a debt trap. Yeah.
Understood. Okay. Victor, let me come back to you, because it's an interesting kind of narrative here to see China, it used to be considered the world's factory. Everyone wanted to outsource their manufacturing to China. And now some see, because of China's massive development and its burgeoning middle class, China is looking for ways to kind of outsource its factories and its jobs to Africa. Is that how you see it?
Well, this is only part of the story. I would say over the past 43 years, China has made great transformation in its economic development, in uplifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And one key pillar of this transformation is building up infrastructure and connectivity of all kinds throughout China. I think China wants to share its experience and success stories with many countries in the world, especially in Africa. I would say Africa is the continent which is the least interconnected within the continent itself. And I think the demand for infrastructure projects, roads, railways, airports, seaports, you name it, is huge. And China is willing to commit as much as possible to Africa, but it will not be sufficient. I think the better way is that as many countries as possible, from Europe, from North America, Japan, etc., all pitch in to invest in infrastructure connectivity projects in Africa. Now, China does need to share its manufacturing capabilities and expertise with many countries in the world, mainly because many African countries have their own expertise and resources. And by migrating some of the manufacturing capacities to Africa, actually will serve mutual benefit. But the key now is to help nation building capabilities in African countries and focusing on infrastructure rollout, because without infrastructure and connectivity, it will be hugely costly to do manufacturing and trading in Africa.
But overall, I mean, Aly-Khan Satchu, I mean, it sounds, hearing from Victor, like there's really nothing but mostly upside here. Is that the truth, or are there some serious pitfalls? I mean, but even if there are, is it still the case that at least, investment from China and trying to develop some of the much-needed infrastructure across the continent is definitely, better than most other alternatives out there?
So I think there's been plenty of nuance and recalibration in this relationship over the last 2 decades. Is when we've had the intensity of the China-Africa relationship really take off. I think we had a period until I would say about 2013, 14, when China was providing tremendous liquidity towards this engagement. And at times, I think that liquidity was quite overwhelming. Africa did not have the absorption capacity for that liquidity. I think from the previous FOCAC in 2018, when President Xi Jinping spoke about the end of vanity, we've seen a massive recalibration in this relationship. I think to some extent, the Chinese government is a little bit maxed out at the sovereign level of lending and is now speaking about lending to institutions, to banks, etc. So that's an interesting and significant development. I think a lot of people also picked up on this reduction of the Chinese commitment, the latest FOCAC of about $20 billion. And I think, however, what my takeaway from that recent FOCAC was it was a much sharper document. It was a much sharper and more and very interesting FOCAC for me. A determination to increase productivity in the agri sector. Africa, and that's where it's mutually beneficial to both China and Africa. Africa needs to raise the amount of food it produces. China has a challenge in that area as well. So I think we've seen more sophistication, more nuance. People might take a takeaway in terms of commitment, but I think the commitment has changed from a sovereign risk down and is trying to percolate lower down. So I think, look, if you look at this relationship, it's not uniform, it's not monolithic, and it's changing and evolving.
Okay. Ovigwe, if I can come back to you actually on the question of Eritrea that you alluded to, because you do specialize in Africa's international relations. As we said, Eritrea has been a bit of a pariah state, yet China is prepared for rather full engagement. Let me ask you, though, under what conditions do you think that relationship is going to develop, and how much does China's engagement with Ethiopia and Eritrea actually help those relations?
Yeah, so when we're looking at China-Eritrea relationship at this moment, the question is under what context? And one of the most important things you have to mention is that conflict in Tigray, in Ethiopia, of which you have Eritrea being the key ally of Ethiopia. So but at the same time, if you look at China also has been a very big investor in Ethiopia, in my perspective. So you have China putting out investment into manufacturing. Like for example, you have Fujian, a shoe manufacturing company. China has essentially picked Ethiopia as like a pilot for manufacturing. But the problem with Ethiopia is that it is landlocked. So of course it needs access to the sea for it to be able to trade. So if you have, for instance, with Eritrea coming into the BRI, you have a case where it is easier for Eritrea and Ethiopia to build more connectivity to allow Ethiopia exports to access through port in Masaba and other ports in Eritrea. But the issue now, you have to overcome the conflict on the ground, and overcoming that conflict, which is going to be a very problematic in terms of building those connectivity projects, is very crucial. So one of the most important things from my perspective is to have where can China really come in terms of resolving that conflict, because it is important for the economic development of Ethiopia, and also for Eritrea, that will be like an transit country for Ethiopian goods and even imports even coming into Ethiopia. So more specifically, overcoming that would require a balancing act, because we know that the U.S. is playing a role that has not really been very helpful. So how Ethiopia and Eritrea are going to manage that relationship in that context will be very, very crucial going forward.
Yeah. Victor, let me ask you about that. I mean, he says overcoming the conflict on the ground, especially between Eritrea and the Tigray rebels and Ethiopia, is going to be very important for this Eritrean-Ethiopian relationship and China's relationship with the region going forward. That is to say that sometimes these aren't easy places to do business because there is elements of conflict and other complications. I mean, is China really getting return on its investments, especially in conflict-ridden areas that China does go into?
Yes, indeed. If you look at China-Eritrea relations, it's good, and the prospect will be good. But if you look around Eritrea, if you look at China-Egyptian relations, China's relations with the Sudan, both north and south, with Ethiopia, with Somalia, for example, and across the Gulf to the Middle East. China has a very, very good long-standing relations with all the neighboring countries of Eritrea. So I think the message China wants to bring to Eritrea is keep stability, keep peace, and these will be the precondition for your development, and capitalize on your very rare and advantageous geopolitical positions in the Red Sea, and focus on logistics and connectivity. And I think this will be the recipe for great transformation of Eritrea. And China deals with Eritrea as importantly as China will deal with all the other much larger neighboring countries of Eritrea. This is the true spirit of equality and mutual benefit. And as far as the development potential of Eritrea is concerned, from the Chinese perspective, it is huge. As I mentioned, logistics, connectivity, and shipping, for example, in addition to mining, agricultural development, etc. But you need to have peace and stability as the preconditions to be satisfied before economic recovery and transformation can really take off.
Okay, Aly-Khan Satchu, let me go back to something Ovigwe was talking about, because he said, you know, the United States hasn't, in the eyes of a number of analysts, hasn't played the most positive role in Africa, especially given what the economic potential could have been. And now we're seeing the U.S., you know, because they say they base their decisions often on their democratic values. They've now said no more with Eritrea, no more with Ethiopia, no more with Mali, no more with Guinea. So here comes China. Do you think the U.S. should actually feel threatened by China's development with these relationships and the potential for profit and the exploitation of minerals, especially in the region, by China?
That's a very interesting question. I think what we've watched particularly in the recent past and with Trump, is the U.S. losing political purchase on the continent. I think if you look at Sudan, some of these comments that are coming out of Secretary Blinken are basically kind of washing their hands of the situation. I think, if you looked 10, 15 years ago, the US had much more purchase on the African continent. You've had not only the emergence of China, but the emergence of middle powers as well, Turkey, the UAE, and the likes of these guys who seem to be able to move the needle in these countries you've described much more than the US can at the moment. I think, just to come back to the Chinese issue, I think, China has had this non-interference in internal affairs policy, which has resonated with governments in Africa a great deal and is contrasted with the US, who are interested in promoting democratic issues and so forth. But I think for the Chinese as well, this is going to be a challenge that they're going to have to manage. And I think they've already begun to manage it a lot more. They can't be all in with governments which are not necessarily that popular. If you take the Eritrean regime, I just count the number of refugees out of Eritrea. This is a vote not in favor of that regime. So it's a classic challenge that I think China will also be facing, which will be that an all-in bet on a regime is not the same as an all-in bet on the citizens. The citizens probably are aspiring for something different to what the heads of these governments might be doing. And I think over the last 24 months in particular, I think the Chinese government have become much more cognizant of this challenge, and I think have begun to reach out more to civil society, to opinion shapers in these countries, and I think have taken a much more sophisticated stance than they had been taking before.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, we just have a little over a minute left, and I just want to give Ovigwe some time for your final thoughts.
Yeah, so basically, I would like to finish off with what my colleague Aly-Khan was saying. One of the things that is very crucial is we cannot emphasize enough that we need partners in Africa that actually take seriously the principle of non-interference. Because if you are a small and weak power, all you have is diplomacy, and you want to hope that the major powers who are much stronger than you adhere to the principle of non-interference in your domestic affairs. And while China, like Ali said, it seems to be working more easily in the continent, working more easily with African leaders, because they don't do that. Whether you're democratic or you're not democratic, if you are ready to deal with China, the Chinese are ready to deal with you. But we don't have that with the US, because most often than not, when you put out these issues of democracy, elections on the table for African countries, but for instance in the Middle East and Gulf countries, your closest allies are actually monarchs that don't even hold any elections, then there's a bit of hypocrisy there. So for us, it's why don't we focus on what exactly we want? Infrastructure, trade, and investment, and let us develop in our own way. Of course, will be very different from what you have in the US. And that's one thing that is emphasized even in FOCAC documents, where there's respect for each other's mutual development. That's something that I think the US can learn from if you want to improve its relationship with the African continent.
Okay, Ovigwe, we will have to leave it there. Thank you so much, all three of my panelists, for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers, and our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter @the_newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.